The dish was still warm in my hands when she said it. I had spent 3 hours on that casserole. Chicken and wild rice, the kind that takes patience, the kind that fills a kitchen with the smell of thyme and butter, and something that feels, for a little while, like everything is going to be all right. I had wrapped it in a dish towel before I left my apartment, the way I always did when I brought food somewhere I wanted to feel welcome. The towel was one Robert had picked out years ago at a farmer's market in Franklin, blue and white stripes. I don't know why I remember that, I just do. The drive to Daniel's house took 20 minutes. I had made it dozens of times. I knew which stoplight took forever and which turn to take early to avoid the backup near the interstate. Nashville, in the evening, has a particular kind of light, amber and low, the kind that makes everything look a little warmer than it actually is. I remember thinking, as I pulled onto their street, that I was glad Daniel had called, that maybe things were shifting, that maybe the distance I had been feeling for the past several months was just the ordinary friction of a new marriage finding its footing, and not something worse. I parked in the driveway and carried the dish to the front door. Daniel answered before I knocked. His face opened into a smile, the same smile he had given me since he was 7 years old, wide and slightly lopsided, the one that had always made me feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. He pulled me into a hug and said he was glad I came. And for a moment, I believed him completely. The dining room smelled like garlic and something roasted. The table was set carefully, cloth napkins, the good glasses, candles that had already burned down an inch. It looked like a dinner meant to impress someone. I set the casserole dish on the kitchen counter and moved toward the table. There was a chair beside Daniel, the natural place, the place I had always sat when I came for dinner in the months before Kristen moved in. I sat down without thinking about it. It felt like the most ordinary thing in the world. It wasn't. Kristen came out of the kitchen carrying a salad bowl. She was dressed in a cream-colored blouse, her dark hair pulled back neatly, her expression composed in that particular way she had, pleasant on the surface, but arranged the way a hotel lobby is arranged. She set the bowl on the table and then looked at me, not at the table, at me, specifically at the chair I was sitting in. She said my name first, Ellie, and then she said, very calmly, the way you might point out that someone had accidentally taken the wrong coat from a rack, that seat is not for you. The room went quiet. I mean completely quiet, the kind where you suddenly notice the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of a car passing outside and the way your own heartbeat feels louder than it should. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at his plate, not at me, not at Kristen. At his plate, as if there were something written there he needed to finish reading. I waited 3 seconds. I know it was 3 because I counted them without meaning to, the way you do when you are trying to hold something together that is beginning to crack. Then I pushed my chair back and stood up. I did not say anything. I had 35 years of standing in front of rooms full of teenagers who were testing exactly how much they could get away with, and the most powerful thing I ever learned in that time was this. Sometimes the most devastating response is no response at all. You simply make your choice visible, and you let them sit with what they've done. I walked back to the kitchen. The casserole dish was on the counter where I had left it, still wrapped in Robert's blue and white dish towel. Kristen said I could leave it. Her voice was helpful, neutral, the voice of someone who believed they had already won. I picked up the dish and tucked it under my arm. I told her I thought I'd take it home. Daniel stood halfway, his mouth opening. Some unfinished sentence caught somewhere between his chest and his throat. He didn't finish it. He sat back down. I walked to the front door. I opened it myself. The night air outside was cool and still, the way Nashville gets in the early part of autumn when the heat finally loosens its grip and the trees on the residential streets start to turn at the edges. I walked down the driveway slowly. Not because I wasn't hurting, I was, but because I had learned, a long time ago, that how you leave a room matters. It is the last thing people see, and sometimes the only thing they remember. I got into my car. I placed the casserole dish on the passenger seat and sat there for a moment without starting the engine. Through the dining room window, I could see the warm glow of the candles, the shapes of Daniel and Kristen moving at the table, settling back into the evening as though nothing had happened, as though I had simply stepped out for some air. The tears came quietly. No sound, no gasping, just the kind that moved down your face slowly and steadily, the way rain runs down a window. I let them come. I didn't wipe them away. I just sat there in the dark with a casserole dish on the passenger seat and the smell of thyme still faintly in the air, and I thought about something Robert said to me once, years ago, standing in the backyard of the house we had lived in for 30 years, looking out at the land that ran behind the property line. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, without any particular drama, "That land will always take care of you, Ellie." I had nodded and thought he meant it the way people mean things when they are being sentimental. A comfort, a figure of speech, something warm to say on a quiet evening. I started the engine. I pulled out of their driveway and drove home through the amber Nashville dark, the dish towel tucked around the casserole, the windows slightly fogged from the warmth of the food. What Kristen didn't know, what Daniel didn't know, was that the house they were sitting in was never truly theirs to begin with. Before that evening, there was a life worth understanding. Most people, when they think about a teacher's life, picture summers off and short workdays and the comfortable rhythm of a school calendar. What they don't picture is the Tuesday in October when a 15-year-old boy sits in the back of your classroom and stares at the wall for 40 minutes straight, and you realize, from the particular quality of his stillness, that something has happened at home. Or the Friday afternoon when a girl who has never raised her hand suddenly answers a question with such precision that the whole room goes quiet and you think there she is. There is the person she has been this whole time. I taught English literature at Jefferson High School in Nashville for 35 years. Room 14, second floor, east wing, the one with the window that looked out over the parking lot and, beyond it, the low green hill that turned gold every October. I started in the fall of 1981, fresh out of Vanderbilt, with a cardboard box of books and more optimism than experience. I retired in the spring of 2016 with the same cardboard box, considerably more books, and something I had not expected to accumulate in a classroom, an almost unreasonable ability to read people. That is what 35 years of teaching gives you, if you pay attention. Not just patience, though you get plenty of that. What you really develop, over time, is a kind of quiet attentiveness. You learn to watch without appearing to watch. You learn that the most important information is rarely in what people say. It is in what they do when they think no one is paying attention. I did not know, back then, how useful that skill would eventually become. I met Robert Harmon in the fall of 1983 at a parent information night at Jefferson High. He was not a parent, he had come with his sister, whose son was starting 9th grade and who had asked Robert to drive her because her car was in the shop. He sat in the back of the gymnasium in a work jacket that still had a faint trace of joint compound on the sleeve, and he listened to every word the principal said with the kind of focused attention you rarely see in adults at those events. Most people were looking at their watches. Robert was taking notes on a folded piece of paper he had pulled from his shirt pocket. He found me afterward near the refreshment table and introduced himself with a handshake that was firm without being performative. He told me he was a contractor, and then said, without preamble, that he thought the reading list I had described in my brief remarks sounded like exactly what his nephew needed. He had read 2 of the books himself. We talked for 40 minutes. I missed the drive home I had planned and didn't mind at all. Robert had grown up in Murfreesboro and moved to Nashville in his mid-20s with a contractor's license and enough saved to put a deposit on a small piece of land on the eastern edge of the city. Not a house, just land. A half-acre lot in a neighborhood that was quiet then, and as Robert had quietly calculated, would not stay quiet for long. He had looked at the zoning maps, talked to people at the county office, done the kind of slow, unglamorous research that most people skip because it doesn't feel exciting enough. Land is the only thing that lasts, he told me on our 3rd date, sitting on the tailgate of his truck eating barbecue from a place on Nolensville Road. He said it without pride, just as a statement of fact. Everything else you can build or buy or replace. But land, once it's gone, it's gone. And once it's yours, it's yours. I remember thinking it was an unusual thing for a 30-year-old man to say. Most people his age were talking about cars or what they were doing next year. Robert was talking about what would still be standing in 30 years. I found it, unexpectedly, one of the most attractive things I had ever heard. We were married in the summer of 1985 at a small church off Gallatin Pike. Daniel arrived 3 years later, 7 pounds, 4 ounces, with Robert's jawline and, as it turned out, my stubbornness. Daniel grew up in the house Robert built on that eastern lot, the one purchased before we met. 3 bedrooms, a covered porch, a backyard with a persimmon tree that dropped fruit every September. It was not a large house, but it was solid. Robert had built it the way he did everything carefully, without rushing, with attention to what would hold under pressure. That is how Robert lived. Not loudly, not with any need for recognition. He coached Daniel's Little League team for 6 years. He showed up to every school event I ever organized, always in the same work jacket, always a little early. He was not a man who said "I love you" in every sentence. He was a man who showed up consistently for 30 years, which is a different kind of saying it, and I have come to believe a more reliable one. He still drove out on weekends to look at land, not always to buy, sometimes just to look. He had a particular appreciation for undeveloped lots, for the potential in a piece of ground that hadn't yet been decided. He would stand at the edge of a property the way I stood in front of a new class on the first day of school, not seeing what was there, but what could be. Robert believed in 2 things, family and land. He spent his whole life protecting both. What I didn't know was exactly how far ahead he had planned. Robert didn't leave the way people do in movies. He left the way he lived quietly, with more intention than anyone gave him credit for. The diagnosis came in October, 4 years ago. Robert had been complaining of fatigue for several weeks, not the ordinary tiredness of a man in his mid-60s who still worked physical jobs, but a deeper kind, the kind that sleep didn't touch. I had been after him to see a doctor for most of September. He finally went on a Thursday afternoon while I was at the grocery store, and he called me in the parking lot on my way back to the car. "It's my heart," he said. His voice was level. He could have been reading me the weather forecast. The cardiologist used the word significant. Significant damage, significant risk, limited options at this stage. Robert listened to everything the doctor said, asked 3 careful questions, and then drove himself home and made dinner. Pork chops and green beans, the way he always made them, with a little apple cider vinegar in the pan at the end. I sat across from him at the kitchen table and watched him eat and tried to find the shape of what our life was going to look like now. Those last 6 months were not what I expected. I had braced for something heavy and gray, for the particular weight that settles over a house when illness moves in. But Robert didn't give illness the run of the place. He went to his appointments. He took his medications. He slowed down on the jobs he was still consulting on, handed off the physical work to younger men, but kept his mind in it. He said staying useful was the best medicine anyone had ever prescribed him, and the cardiologist, who had clearly met men like Robert before, didn't argue. What we had, in those 6 months, was mornings. Robert had always been an early riser up before 6, coffee made by the time I came downstairs, the kitchen already holding that particular warmth of a day that had been started properly. But in those last months, the mornings became something we were both deliberate about. We sat at the kitchen table together, sometimes talking, sometimes not, with the backyard visible through the window and the Nashville light coming in low and gold the way it does in winter. We talked about Daniel. We talked about the neighborhood and how much it had changed since Robert first bought the land. We talked about books I was reading and jobs Robert was advising on and small, ordinary things that felt, in retrospect, like everything. There were things he didn't finish saying. I noticed it first in January, about 3 months before he passed. We were sitting in the kitchen one morning, and Robert set his coffee cup down and looked at me with a particular expression, careful, deliberate, the look he wore when he was about to say something he had been turning over in his mind for a while. He started to speak. He said, "Ellie, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you sooner." And then he stopped. Not because he changed his mind, because his breathing shifted in that way it had been doing lately, a tightening that wasn't quite pain but wasn't comfortable either, and the moment passed, and we both let it go. I told myself we had time. That was the thing I told myself most often in those months, the small, quiet lie that kept the days moving forward. He tried again in February, on a Sunday evening after Daniel had come for dinner and gone home. Robert was tired that night, more tired than usual, and I was washing the dishes when he came to stand in the kitchen doorway and said my name in that particular way that meant he was serious. I turned around. He looked at me for a long moment. "The safe," he said. And then Daniel called back about something he had forgotten, and Robert answered the phone, and by the time he hung up he was too exhausted to continue, and we went to bed. He passed on a Tuesday morning in March, quietly, in the early hours, before the light had fully come up. I was there. I held his hand. The room was still and the house was warm, and outside the persimmon tree in the backyard was just beginning to bud, the way it always did at the end of winter, patient and reliable, exactly on schedule. The grief that followed was the kind you cannot prepare for, even when you know it is coming. It moved through the weeks and months in waves, sometimes distant and manageable, sometimes arriving without warning in the middle of an ordinary afternoon and taking the breath right out of me. Daniel visited often in the first year. Friends from Jefferson High called and came by. I was not alone, exactly. But a house where one person has lived for 30 years and then doesn't anymore is a particular kind of quiet that company can soften but not fill. I learned to live inside that quiet. I made my routines smaller and more deliberate. Morning coffee, still at the kitchen table, still facing the backyard. Evening walks around the neighborhood. Books, always books. I found, slowly, that the routines Robert and I had built together could hold me up, even when he wasn't there to share them, the way a well-built structure holds its shape long after the builder has moved on. The safe was in the bedroom closet, behind the winter coats, where it had always been. Robert had kept documents in it for as long as I could remember, insurance papers, property records, the kind of things that live in safes because they matter too much to lose. After he passed, I moved his personal items carefully, sorted through what needed sorting, and left the safe exactly where it was. He left something in the safe, a sealed envelope. I had walked past it 1,000 times in 4 years and never opened it. I don't know why. Maybe I wasn't ready. Maybe I was waiting for the right moment. I just didn't know the right moment would arrive the way it did. 2 years after we buried Robert, Daniel called me with that particular excitement in his voice, the kind I hadn't heard since he was 17. It was a Sunday evening in early spring. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a book I hadn't been able to concentrate on for the better part of an hour, half reading and half watching the light fade over the backyard. The persimmon tree was budding again, right on schedule, the way it always did at the end of March. Daniel's name came up on my phone and I answered on the second ring. He asked how I was doing, the way he always did. But the question was faster than usual, the preamble of a man who had something else he wanted to get to. I had taught teenagers for 35 years. I recognized the rhythm immediately. So I said, "I'm fine, sweetheart. What's going on?" And there was a pause, half a second, the kind that contains a small decision, and then he said, "Mom, there's someone I want you to meet." Those words. There is something about those particular words, coming from your child, that rearranges the air in the room. I set the book down. I felt something warm and careful move through me at the same time, the hope of a mother who wants her son to be happy, and the quiet alertness of a woman who has spent her career learning that the most important information is always in the details. We agreed to have dinner the following Saturday at a restaurant downtown, a newer place on Fifth Avenue that Daniel said Kristen had suggested. She knew the chef, apparently. I noted that without attaching any particular meaning to it and went back to my book, though I read the same paragraph 4 times before I gave up and made tea instead. The restaurant was the kind that had exposed brick walls and low lighting and a menu that took itself seriously. I arrived a few minutes early and found them already at the table near the window. Daniel stood when he saw me and waved with the easy warmth he had carried since childhood, unguarded, genuine, the kind of wave that makes you feel, for a moment, like everything in the world is fine. Kristen stood as well. She was tall, dark-haired, dressed in a charcoal wrap dress that was elegant without being showy. She extended her hand and said, "Mrs. Harmon, it's so nice to finally meet you." Her voice was warm and controlled in equal measure, and her handshake was confident, not aggressive, but practiced, the kind you develop when meeting people matters professionally. She was, by any reasonable standard, impressive. Daniel was clearly proud in the way that people are proud when they know they have found something good and are still slightly amazed by their own luck. I watched him watch her across the table and felt something genuine relief, actually, that he seemed this happy. 2 years was a long time to carry the weight of losing his father, and whatever else this woman was, she had clearly given my son something to look forward to. We talked through the appetizers easily enough. Kristen worked in property development. She managed acquisitions for a regional firm based out of downtown Nashville. She spoke about it fluently, with the confidence of someone who genuinely liked what she did. She asked Daniel questions more than she talked about herself, which I noted as a mark in her favor. She laughed at the right moments and deflected compliments in the self-deprecating way that charming people learn early. It was somewhere around the main course that the conversation shifted. Kristen asked about the neighborhood where Daniel had grown up, the house Robert built on the eastern lot. She framed it as curiosity, the natural interest of a woman getting to know her partner's history. But the questions were precise in a way that didn't quite match casual interest. She asked about the square footage of the lot. She asked which street it was on and whether the surrounding parcels were residential or mixed use. She asked, almost in passing, whether the neighborhood had seen much development pressure in recent years. I answered carefully, the way I answered questions in class when I wasn't certain where a student was actually trying to go. I said the neighborhood had changed considerably since Robert first bought the land. Kristen nodded with what appeared to be polite interest. Property in that part of the city has really moved, she said. The Eastern Corridor is one of the most undervalued stretches left inside the city limits. Anyone who got in early did very well. I said that Robert had bought the land in the late 70s. She said, "Smart man," and smiled at Daniel. Later, as we were leaving, we stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant while Daniel went to bring the car around. The evening was cool, the street busy with the particular Saturday night energy that downtown Nashville has been building for years. Kristen stood beside me and looked out at the row of older buildings across the street, the kind of low-rise brick structures that developers had been eyeing along that corridor for the better part of a decade. "This neighborhood has such potential," she said, not to me specifically, more to the air in front of her, the way a person speaks when they are thinking out loud. I went still inside. Robert had said those exact words to me 20 years earlier, standing at the edge of a lot he was considering in Germantown. Same cadence, same quiet certainty. He had meant it as observation, the honest assessment of a man who understood land. Hearing it from Kristen, in that context, about that neighborhood, produced a sensation I could not immediately name. Daniel pulled up to the curb. Kristen smiled at me, bright, composed, entirely pleasant, and said it had been wonderful to meet me. I smiled back and said the same. I told myself it was a coincidence. I had spent 35 years teaching children to trust their instincts. I should have listened to my own. The first month after Kristen moved in, everything seemed fine. The second month was when I started keeping notes. Daniel and Kristen married in September. A small ceremony at a venue in East Nashville with exposed wood beams and string lights, and exactly the kind of quiet elegance that Kristen favored. It was a good day. Daniel looked happier than I had seen him in years, and I held on to that, the way he stood at the altar with his shoulders back and his face open, like a man who had finally found solid ground after a long time searching. I drove home that evening telling myself that whatever doubts I had carried since that dinner on Fifth Avenue were the ordinary anxieties of a mother adjusting to a new chapter. Nothing more. They moved into the house on Deerwood Lane in October. It was a house Daniel had put a deposit on the previous spring, a 3-bedroom craftsman in a quiet pocket of East Nashville, the kind of street where people walk their dogs in the evening and wave at neighbors they actually know. I had helped Daniel pick out the living room furniture. I knew which drawer in the kitchen stuck and which burner on the stove ran hot. I had a key. By November, the key still worked, but the house had started to feel different. The first thing I noticed was the photograph. There had been a framed photo of Robert on the bookshelf in the living room, one I had given Daniel 2 Christmases ago. A picture of Robert at a job site in the early 90s, hard hat pushed back on his head, squinting at something in the distance with that particular focused expression he wore when he was solving a problem. It was a good photograph. It looked like him. One Saturday afternoon I stopped by with soup. Daniel had mentioned a cold and the shelf had been rearranged. A small succulent in a ceramic pot sat where Robert's photograph had been. I asked Daniel about it later, casually. He said Kristen thought the space needed a cleaner look. I nodded and said nothing. The following month it was the study. Kristen mentioned, at a Sunday dinner, that she had been working from home more frequently and that the small room off the hallway would make an ideal office space. Daniel agreed before I had any particular opinion to offer. Within 2 weeks, the room had been emptied of Daniel's drafting table and reorganized with a standing desk, 2 monitors, and a filing cabinet that locked. I had never seen a locked filing cabinet in that house before. In January, Kristen began asking questions about the property, not dramatically, just the way she did everything, folded into ordinary conversation so that each question seemed reasonable on its own. She asked Daniel whether the deed was in his name alone. She asked about the property tax history and whether there had ever been any liens. She asked, during one visit, whether there were any documents related to the house that were kept off-site with a lawyer, perhaps, or in a family safe. I was in the kitchen when she asked that last one. I heard it clearly. I set down the dish I was drying and stood still for a moment, listening to Daniel say he didn't think so, that as far as he knew, everything was straightforward. Kristen said that was good, that it was always smart to have everything organized in one place. That evening, after they thought I had moved to the living room, I came back to the kitchen for my cardigan and found Kristen standing at the small desk in the corner, the one where Daniel kept household files in an unlocked drawer. Her phone was in her hand, screen facing down. The drawer was open. She looked up when I came in and smiled without any visible discomfort. "Just getting a pen," she said. I smiled back and picked up my cardigan from the chair. I had not been born yesterday. I had also not spent 35 years in a classroom without learning what it looks like when someone is doing something they do not want witnessed. That night, I got out a yellow legal pad, the same kind I had used for lesson plans since 1981, and I began writing things down. Dates. What I had observed, exact words when I could remember them. It was not yet alarm. It was the habit of a woman trained to document what she noticed, because documentation, I had learned long ago, is what separates a feeling from a fact. What happened next was harder to write down, because it did not happen in a drawer or on a shelf or in a room I could describe. It happened in the space between Daniel and me, slowly, over the course of several weeks, in a way I could feel, but not immediately name. Daniel had always called me on Sunday evenings. It was not a formal arrangement, just something that had developed naturally over the years, a standing habit neither of us had ever needed to discuss. The calls started coming less frequently. Then, when they did come, they were shorter. His voice had a new quality, careful, slightly measured, the way people sound when they are aware of being listened to. In March, Daniel came by alone on a Wednesday afternoon. He sat at my kitchen table with his coffee and talked about work and weather and the renovation Kristen was planning for the back porch. Then, gently, with the particular awkwardness of someone delivering a message they have been rehearsing, he mentioned that I might want to call before coming over, that Kristen appreciated knowing in advance, that it was just about having some structure. I said, of course. I refilled his coffee. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing of consequence. 2 days later, I was on the phone with Daniel when I heard Kristen's voice in the background, low but clear enough. "Your mother seems confused lately," she was saying. "I think it might be worth keeping an eye on." Daniel made a small sound. Then he told me he had to go. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after that. I was not confused. I was 62 years old and I had spent my entire professional life paying careful attention to what was happening in rooms where I was responsible for other people. I knew exactly what I had just heard. I knew exactly what it meant. I opened the yellow legal pad and wrote down the date, the time, and the words as precisely as I could remember them. Then I added a new section at the top of the page. I labeled it Patterns. She was doing two things at once, rearranging the house and rearranging my son's mind, and she was very, very good at both. 8 months of small silences. Then Daniel called. It was a Thursday evening in late April. I was sitting in the backyard with a glass of iced tea, watching the persimmon tree in that particular way I had developed over the past 2 years, not looking at it exactly, but letting it sit in my field of vision the way certain familiar things do when you need to feel like something is still in its right place. The evening light was low and warm, the kind that Nashville does especially well in spring, when the air finally softens and the days start to feel like a promise being kept. My phone buzzed on the armrest. "Daniel." I answered the way I always did, trying not to let the relief into my voice too quickly. He asked how I was doing, and this time the question was different, unhurried, the way it used to be before the calls got shorter. He asked about the garden. He asked whether I had finished the book I had mentioned the last time we talked, the one about the family in Vermont that I had recommended to him years ago and finally gotten around to reading myself. He remembered that I had mentioned it. That mattered more than he probably knew. Then he said, "Mom, why don't you come for dinner on Saturday? Kristen's been experimenting with a new recipe and I thought it would be nice. Just a regular evening. Just a regular evening. I held those words in my mind for a moment after we hung up. 4 words that, in a different season of life, would have been the most ordinary thing in the world. Now they felt like a door being opened that had been closed for a long time. I told myself not to read too much into it. I had been a teacher long enough to know that hope, handled carelessly, becomes its own kind of problem. But I was also a mother. And some things are stronger than good judgment. Saturday came slowly, the way Saturdays do when you are looking forward to something. I spent the morning doing errands, the hardware store, the dry cleaners, the farmer's market on Charlotte Avenue where I usually picked up whatever looked good that week. By early afternoon, I was back in my kitchen, and I had already decided what I was going to bring. Chicken and wild rice casserole, the same dish I had been making for 30 years, the one Daniel had grown up eating on the kind of weeknights when the weather turned and something warm and substantial was exactly what was needed. I had made it at every significant occasion I could remember the night before Daniel started high school, the week Robert came home from his first hospital stay years ago, the dinner I made for myself the evening after Robert's funeral when I needed to do something with my hands. I moved through the kitchen with the particular focus that cooking gives you when you are making something that means something. The time went in at the right moment. The cream reduced exactly as it should. The smell that built in the kitchen over those 2 hours was the smell of continuity of a life that had been fed and tended and carried forward through ordinary acts, repeated with care. I wrapped the dish in the blue and white towel, the same one from the Franklin Farmers Market, the one Robert had picked out. It had been washed so many times the colors had softened, but it still held its shape. I placed it carefully in a box and set it on the passenger seat of my car. The drive across town took 25 minutes. Nashville in late April holds the light until almost 8 o'clock, and the city in that early evening hour has a particular quality, the traffic thinning, the neighborhoods quieting, the last of the sun catching the windows of houses along the residential streets and turning them amber. I drove with the window cracked, the smell of the casserole warm in the car, and tried to hold on to the simplest version of what this evening was. My son had called. He had asked me to come. That was enough. I turned onto Deerwood Lane and felt the small, involuntary lift that happens when a familiar street comes into view. I had driven this road dozens of times in the months before everything shifted. I knew the oak tree at the corner that dropped acorns every fall, and the house with the blue shutters 3 doors down, and the way the streetlight near the end of the block buzzed faintly in the heat. These details had been mine, too, for a while. I parked and carried the dish to the front door. Daniel answered before I knocked. His face when he saw me was the face I remembered, unguarded, warm, that lopsided smile. He pulled me into a hug that lasted a real moment, not the brief, formal kind that had started to appear in the past several months. I let myself hold on. Inside, the house had continued its transformation. The walls were lighter than I remembered, a warm white that made the rooms feel larger. The furniture in the living room was new, clean lines, carefully chosen, everything coordinated in a way that suggested considerable thought had gone into it. I noticed, without stopping to look, that the wall where Daniel used to keep a collection of framed photographs from his childhood was bare, except for a single large piece of abstract art in muted earth tones. Robert's photograph was not anywhere I could see. I carried the casserole to the kitchen and set it on the counter. Daniel poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and handed me one, and we stood in the kitchen talking about nothing in particular, his work, a project he was excited about, and the neighborhood association meeting he had attended the week before. It was easy in a way that the past several months had not been, and I felt the tension I had been carrying for a long time begin, very slowly, to release. When Daniel moved toward the dining room, I followed. He had already set the tablecloth, napkins, candles, the good glasses. I moved to the chair beside him, the one I had always taken when I came for these dinners, the seat that had always been there waiting, the way certain things simply know where they belong. I sat down. Daniel settled beside me. The candles had been burning long enough to soften the light in the room, and the smell of whatever Kristen was finishing in the kitchen drifted through the doorway. And for a moment, exactly 4 minutes, though I could not have known that then, everything felt like it used to. Then Kristen walked in from the kitchen and looked at the chair I was sitting in. What happened next took less than 2 minutes, but I have replayed it 10,000 times since. Kristen set the serving dish on the table with the unhurried precision of someone who was exactly where they intended to be. She straightened up and looked at me, not with anger, not with hostility, but with the calm, focused expression of a person identifying a problem they had already decided how to solve. It was the look of someone who had thought about this moment before it arrived. She said my name first, Ellie. A single word, spoken pleasantly, with just enough weight behind it to signal that what followed was not a suggestion. Then she said, "This table is for immediate family." I heard the words clearly. I processed them the way you process something that doesn't make immediate sense, running them back once, twice, checking whether you might have misunderstood. But the sentence was not complicated. It had 6 words and a meaning that could not be softened by any reading I gave it. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at his plate, not at the centerpiece, not at the window, not at the floor, at his plate specifically, in the manner of a man who has chosen a fixed point and intends to keep his eyes on it until a difficult moment resolves itself without his involvement. His jaw was set. His hands were in his lap. He did not look up. The room was the kind of quiet that amplifies. I became aware of the candle flames moving very slightly in the still air, and the low sound of something still finishing on the stove in the kitchen, and the way the floorboard near my chair had always had the faintest creak to it, a detail I had noticed the very first time I walked through this house and had never thought about again until this exact moment. I did not argue. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. Not because I lacked the words. I had 35 years of practice finding the right words in difficult moments, and I had them available to me now. But I had also learned, in those 35 years, that there are situations where argument is not the appropriate tool, where the most truthful response is to take your hands off the wheel and let the other person be fully visible in what they have just done. So I stood up, slowly, without hurry, the way I had always stood up from my desk at Jefferson High at the end of a long day, deliberately, with my back straight. The chair made a small sound against the floor as I pushed it back. No one spoke. I walked to the kitchen. The casserole dish was on the counter where I had played when I arrived, still wrapped in the blue and white towel. The kitchen smelled of whatever Kristen had been preparing, something with rosemary and white wine, something that had taken thought. I stood at the counter for a moment. I did not rush. Kristen appeared in the kitchen doorway behind me. Her voice, when she spoke, was still composed, still helpful, almost. "You can leave that," she said, meaning the dish. Meaning, you do not need to take anything with you on your way out of our home. I picked up the casserole dish and tucked it under my arm, the same way I had carried it in. The towel was still warm from the food inside. I turned toward the door. "I think I'll take it home," I said. I did not look at her when I said it. I did not need to. There are certain exchanges where everything essential has already been communicated, and adding eye contact would only be theater. I had what I came with. I was leaving with it. I walked back through the dining room. Daniel was still at the table. He had shifted slightly in his chair, turned just enough in my direction to suggest he was aware I was passing, but not enough to constitute a decision. He said, "Mom, the way people say a word when they want credit for having said it without taking responsibility for what comes next." I paused for 1 second. Not to give him the chance to do something different, I had stopped expecting that some minutes earlier. I paused because he was still my son, and because I had loved him since before he could hold his own head up, and because some things deserve 1 more second even when they have not earned it. Then I walked to the front door and opened it myself. Outside, the April evening was the same as it had been when I arrived. The oak tree at the corner, the blue shutters 3 doors down, the streetlight with its faint buzz. The neighborhood was quiet in the way that residential streets get quiet after dinner time, when everyone has come inside and the world narrows to lit windows and the sound of your own footsteps on the pavement. I walked down the driveway at the same pace I had walked up it. I got into my car. I placed the casserole dish on the passenger seat. The blue and white towel held it steady. I sat there without starting the engine, my hands in my lap, looking through the windshield at the front of the house. The dining room window glowed warm and amber from inside. Through it, I could see, dimly, the shapes of Daniel and Kristen at the table, the soft movement of resuming, of 2 people returning to an evening that had briefly been interrupted. The tears came the same way they had the last time. I sat in this car outside this house quietly, without announcement, sliding down without any particular drama. I let them go. I did not wipe my face. I simply sat in the dark and let what had happened settle into its true shape. After a while, I started the engine. I pulled out of the driveway and drove down Deerwood Lane toward home. The dish beside me held its warmth for a long time, longer than you would expect, the way certain things do when they have been built to last. I drove home with the casserole dish on the passenger seat, still warm, and somewhere between their driveway and mine, I remembered the envelope. I had walked past that safe 1,000 times in 4 years. That night, for the first time, I was ready. I got home just after 9. The apartment was the way I had left it, lights off, except for the lamp in the living room. The book I had been reading open face down on the side table, the kitchen still holding the faint smell of thyme from the afternoon's cooking. I set the casserole dish on the counter without unwrapping it. I did not turn on any additional lights. I stood in the hallway for a moment and let the quiet settle around me the way quiet does when you have come home from something difficult and the house is giving you a moment before it asks anything of you. Then I went to the bedroom. The safe was where it had always been, in the closet, on the floor, behind the winter coats. Robert had installed it himself the first year we were married, bolted to the subfloor the way he did things, with the particular attention to permanence that characterized everything he built. It was a small, safe, gray, with a combination dial that had always required a firm hand on the last number or it would slip. I had opened it dozens of times over the years for insurance documents, for the deed to the old house on Persimmon Lane, for the passports we needed when we took Daniel to Canada for a fishing trip the summer he turned 14. I had not opened it since the week after Robert died, when I went through what needed going through and left the rest exactly as it was. I moved the winter coats aside. I crouched down and put my hand on the dial. My fingers remembered the combination without my needing to think about it. 32 years of muscle memory, reliable as anything. The mechanism released with the small metallic sound I had heard hundreds of times, a sound so ordinary and so specific that hearing it now, in this context, made my chest tighten in a way I had not expected. Inside, the documents were arranged the way Robert had always kept them. Labeled folders, stacked neatly, the edges aligned, insurance on the left, property records in the middle, personal documents on the right. And at the back, standing upright against the rear wall of the safe, was an envelope I had seen before but never opened. It was a standard white envelope, business-sized, sealed with the kind of deliberate pressure that means someone ran their thumb along it twice to be sure. My name was on the front in Robert's handwriting, not Ellie, not Mrs. Harmon, just Eleanor, in the careful, even letters of a man who wrote the way he built without flourish, with full attention to what he was making. I sat down on the floor of the closet with the envelope in my lap. I do not know how long I sat there before I opened it. Long enough for the closet to feel very quiet and very close. Long enough to be aware of the smell of Robert's old work coat still hanging above me, sawdust and something faintly mineral. The smell of a man who spent his life working with his hands. Long enough to understand that whatever was in this envelope was going to change the shape of the evening I had just survived. I broke the seal carefully. The way you open something you want to be able to close again if you need to. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, and behind it a thicker bundle documents, folded together, held with a binder clip. I set the bundle aside and unfolded the letter. Robert's handwriting filled one side of the page. The date at the top was December, 3 months before he passed. He started the way he started most things, without preamble. He wrote that he had been thinking about the land, that he had made a decision some years earlier, when Daniel first started talking about buying a house, to keep the Nashville property in Ellie's name rather than transferring it. He had not told her at the time because he had not wanted to make it complicated, had not wanted it to feel like distrust or withholding. He had simply done it and left the documentation where she would find it if she ever needed it. He wrote that he hoped she would never need it. Then he wrote the reason. Land is protection, Ellie. Keep it in your name until you are certain the people standing on it deserve to be there, not certain the way you are certain about the weather, certain the way you are certain about character. That kind of certainty takes time, and it cannot be rushed by love, even when the love is real. I read that paragraph 3 times. Each time it landed differently. Robert had not been thinking about Kristen. He had not known about the woman his son would eventually marry, had not known about the dinner on Fifth Avenue or the locked filing cabinet or the yellow legal pad I had been keeping for months. He had been thinking about the general truth of the thing, the particular vulnerability of land when families change shape, when new people enter old arrangements and the terms have not been made clear. He had been thinking about protection. He had just been right, without knowing he would need to be right in this specific way. Below the paragraph about the land, Robert had written a name and a phone number, James Whitfield. Below that, he knows everything. Call him if you need to. I set the letter down on my knee and looked at the wall of the closet for a long time. The bundle of documents was still in my hand, property records, survey maps, the original purchase agreement from 1979, all of it in Robert's careful order. Everything that established, clearly and legally, that the land beneath Daniel and Kristen's house still belonged to me. The casserole dish was on the kitchen counter. The blue and white towel was still wrapped around it, still holding whatever warmth was left. I thought about the evening I had just come from the table, the chair, the way Daniel had looked at his plate while his wife told me I was not immediate family. I thought about the envelope I had been walking past for 4 years, sitting in the dark behind the winter coats, waiting. Robert had written the letter 3 months before he died. He didn't know about Kristen. He didn't know about any of this. But somehow, across 4 years and one terrible evening, he had found a way to answer exactly the question I was now asking. James Whitfield had been Robert's lawyer for 22 years. When his assistant put me through, his voice sounded exactly like I remembered, careful and unhurried. I had called at 8:15 in the morning. I had not slept well, not badly exactly, but lightly, the way you sleep when your mind has found something it cannot put down and keeps returning to it in the dark. I had made coffee before 6 and sat at the kitchen table with the bundle of documents from the safe spread out in front of me, reading through each one slowly, the way I would have read a student's paper when I suspected it contained something important that I had not yet found. By the time I picked up the phone, I had read through everything twice. James's office was on Church Street, in a building that had been there since the 1960s and showed it good bones, dark wood paneling, the particular smell of a place where serious work had been done for a long time. Robert had taken me there once, years ago, when we updated our wills. I had sat in the same leather chair across from the same wide desk and watched James Whitfield explain complicated things in simple language, which is a skill most lawyers charge extra for and he seemed to offer as a matter of course. He met me at 11. He was older than I remembered, mid-60s now, with gray at his temples and the unhurried manner of a man who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. He stood when I came in, shook my hand, and gestured to the chair across from his desk without ceremony. He had already pulled Robert's file. I placed the envelope on the desk between us. He looked at it for a moment, then at me. "He told me he'd written one," James said. "He didn't tell me what was in it. He said you'd open it when you needed to." That landed somewhere in my chest and stayed there. I nodded and told him I was ready to understand everything. He opened the file and walked me through it with the same patient precision I remembered. The land on the eastern edge of the city, the original half-acre lot Robert had purchased in 1979, plus the adjacent parcel he had added in 1991 when the owner decided to sell and Robert had been ready. Together, they constituted just under 1.5 acres of property that had appreciated, James noted without drama, considerably over the past 4 decades. The title, he confirmed, was in my name, Eleanor Grace Harmon. It had never been transferred. Robert had discussed the question of transfer on 2 separate occasions over the years, once when Daniel turned 25, and once when Daniel first mentioned wanting to buy a house, and on both occasions had decided, after consideration, to leave the arrangement as it was. James had noted his reasoning in the file each time. Robert's position had been consistent. The land was Ellie's. It would remain Ellie's until Ellie decided otherwise. I listened to all of this carefully. It confirmed what the letter had told me, and hearing it stated in the language of legal documentation, title, deed, recorded instrument, county register, gave it a different kind of weight. The kind that makes things real in a way that even a handwritten letter cannot fully accomplish. Then James set down the file and folded his hands on the desk, and his expression shifted slightly, not to alarm, but to the particular attentiveness of someone who has something additional to say. He said there was something else he wanted to mention. Something that had come across his desk approximately 3 months ago that he had not acted on because he had not been authorized to act on it, but that he had kept a record of because it had seemed, at the time, worth keeping a record of. He opened a second, thinner folder and slid a single sheet across the desk toward me. It was a letter, business stationery, the kind that looked expensive without being ostentatious. The letterhead identified the sender as a financial services company, a small firm I did not recognize, with an address in a part of downtown Nashville I associated with newer developments. The letter was addressed to James Whitfield, attorney at law, and it requested, in formal but straightforward language, information regarding the ownership status of the property at the Eastern Nashville address, the land that was in my name. Specifically, it asked whether the property was encumbered by any existing liens, whether the title was clear, and whether the current title holder would be open to discussing a transfer of interest. I read it twice, then I looked up at James. He said that the return address on the letter, the address to which any response was to be directed, was not the financial firm's downtown office. It was a residential address, a house in East Nashville. He told me the street name. It was Deerwood Lane. I sat with that for a moment. The same street, the same house, the house where, less than 24 hours ago, I had been told I was not immediate family. James said he had not responded to the letter. His position was that correspondence regarding property held in a client's name required the client's authorization before any response could be given, and since I had not contacted him in some time, he had filed the letter and waited. He had considered reaching out to me but had concluded, given the sensitive nature of the request, that it was better to wait until I came to him. I asked when the letter had arrived. He checked the file. 3 months ago, almost exactly. 3 months ago, I had still been coming to Sunday dinners at Deerwood Lane. 3 months ago, Kristen had still been asking me, pleasantly, whether I wanted tea or coffee when I arrived. 3 months ago, the yellow legal pad in my kitchen drawer had fewer than a dozen entries. I looked at the letter on the desk between us for a long moment. The financial firm's name, the Deerwood Lane return address, the careful, formal language requesting information about land that belonged to me. Someone had been asking questions about my land for 3 months, using my son's address, and my son had no idea. I didn't go looking for the truth. The truth found me in a plain white envelope in my mailbox on a Wednesday morning. I almost didn't check the mail that day. It was the kind of mid-September morning that makes Nashville feel like it has remembered what summer was and decided to hold on a little longer, warm and golden, the kind of light that softens everything. I had my coffee, my yellow legal pad, and no particular reason to step outside before noon. But the mail carrier came early, and I heard the box close from the kitchen window. Old habit. 35 years of classroom attendance sheets had trained me to notice small, routine things. The envelope was third in the stack, between a grocery circular and a water bill. No logo on the outside. No return address in the upper corner, just a post office box number in a city I didn't immediately recognize. My name was printed on the label Eleanor G. Harmon with the address of this house, the one Robert and I had shared for 30 years. Not Deerwood Lane, my address. I set the other mail on the kitchen counter and opened it, standing up. The letterhead read Consolidated Lending Solutions, Nashville Division. The date was 3 days prior. The subject line was formal and bureaucratic in the way that bank correspondence always is, and it took me 2 full readings before the meaning of it settled into something I could hold. Consolidated Lending Solutions had issued a mortgage loan against a residential property located at the Deerwood Lane address. During a routine title audit, their records department had identified a discrepancy in the ownership chain. The land beneath the property, the original lot, separately recorded from the structure, was listed under the name Eleanor Grace Harmon in the county assessor's office. This conflicted with the loan documentation. The letter requested that I contact their verification department within 10 business days to clarify my ownership status. I read it again. Then I read it a third time. Not because the language was complicated. The language was plain. I read it 3 times because the human mind, when it encounters something it did not anticipate, needs more than one pass to accept that the words on the page mean exactly what they say. I carried the letter to the kitchen table and sat down. The loan amount on the first page was listed as $74,500. I turned to the second page. There was a reference number for a second loan. Same property, same borrower listed as Kristen M. Harmon. Amount, $68,000. I turned to the third page. A third loan. $61,200. I set the pages down side by side on the kitchen table, the way I used to lay out student essays when I was grading a full set and needed to see the pattern across all of them at once. 3 pages, 3 loan reference numbers, 3 different origination dates spanning 14 months. The total, when I wrote it on the edge of my yellow legal pad, came to just over $203,000. Secured against land that still had my name on it. I sat with that number for a long time. Outside, the persimmon tree was still in the warm morning air. The rosemary on the windowsill needed water. The kitchen was exactly the same as it had been 20 minutes earlier when I walked out to the mailbox. Same light, same smell, same quiet, and yet something in the room had changed in a way I couldn't have described precisely. It was the feeling of a floor shifting. Not collapsing, just shifting. I had spent 9 days moving carefully since the dinner at Deerwood Lane. I had opened Robert's safe and read his letter. I had sat in James Whitfield's office and confirmed that the land was mine. I had filed the information away with the precision of someone who had spent a career keeping accurate records. I had been steady. I had been measured. But sitting at that kitchen table with 3 loan statements spread in front of me, I felt something different from steadiness. I felt the particular cold clarity of understanding that comes when isolated facts stop being separate and become a single coherent picture. 14 months. That was how long Kristen had been working with these loans. The first origination date was 4 months after the wedding. 3 months, I noted, before the financial firm had sent the inquiry letter to James Whitfield's office, the one asking about liens and potential transfer. She had not been careless. She had not stumbled into this. She had been methodical, patient, and thorough in the way that people are when they believe they will not be caught. I picked up the letter again and looked at the verification deadline. 10 business days from the date of the letter. That meant I had 7 days remaining. 7 days. I reached for my legal pad and turned to a fresh page. I wrote the date at the top, and then I wrote 3 numbers, and then I wrote a single sentence beneath them. She was using Robert's land as collateral, land she did not own. I looked at that sentence for a long moment. Then I added a second line. Call James tomorrow morning. I folded the bank letter carefully and placed it inside the legal pad's back cover, behind the 11 entries I had already made. Then I sat very still in Robert's kitchen, in the house Robert had built, on the land Robert had protected for 30 years, and I let myself feel the full weight of what I was looking at. 3 loans. $200,000, secured against land that still had my name on it. Kristen hadn't just taken my seat at the table. She had been trying to take everything Robert ever built, and she had been doing it for months. The first person I called was Patricia Walsh. Not because I needed comfort. I was past comfort. I needed someone who had known me for 25 years and wouldn't tell me I was overreacting. She picked up on the second ring. "Can you come over?" I said. A pause short. The kind that Patricia uses to calibrate. When? Give me 20 minutes. She arrived in 18, wearing her gardening clothes and carrying a paper bag from the bakery on 12th Avenue, 2 coffees and a pair of blueberry scones she had clearly just picked up on the way. That was Patricia. She didn't arrive empty-handed to anything, even emergencies. "Sit down," I said before she had her coat off. She looked at the 3 pages spread across the kitchen table and set the bag on the counter without commenting on it. She sat. I sat across from her, the same way I had been sitting for the past hour. "Tell me," she said. So I did. I told her about the safe first, about the envelope with Robert's handwriting on the outside and the December letter inside, the property records bundled beneath the folded pages, the name James Whitfield at the bottom with a phone number. I told her about the drive to Church Street and the oak desk and the way James had said Eleanor Grace Harmon like it was a legal designation, which of course it was. "Robert left her a road map," Patricia said, when I paused. "He left me a road map," I said. "He just didn't know what destination I'd be using it for." I told her about the financial firm's inquiry, the letter that had arrived at James's office 3 months earlier, using Daniel's home address as the return contact. I watched Patricia's jaw settle as she processed that. She didn't speak. She was the kind of person who listens until she has the full picture before she says a word, which was one of the reasons I had called her first. Then I slid the bank letter across the table. She read it the way I had read it once, then again. She turned to the second page, then the third. She set it down. 3 loans, she said. 3 loans. Kristen M. Harmon. Kristen M. Harmon. Patricia looked at the ceiling for a moment the way she does when she is choosing her words carefully rather than saying the first thing that comes to mind. Then she looked back at me. Ellie, I have to tell you something. Her voice had shifted. Not softer, more deliberate. The tone of someone who has been carrying a thing they weren't sure was significant until the moment it suddenly, clearly was. Okay, I said. About 3 weeks before that dinner at Daniel's, maybe 3.5, I was at the coffee place on Hillsborough, the one near the hardware store. I went in for my usual, and when I was waiting at the counter, I saw Kristen through the window at the corner table outside. I kept my face still. Who was she with? A man. I didn't recognize him. Well-dressed, not casual, more like he'd come from a meeting. Dark jacket, no tie. He had a leather portfolio on the table. Patricia pressed her lips together briefly. They were talking closely. Not arguing. Nothing like that, but it was a concentrated kind of conversation, the kind where both people are leaning in. Did she see you? No, I don't think so. I got my coffee and left. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it was a work meeting, someone from her office. She paused. I didn't say anything to you because I had no reason to think it was anything. But now, looking at those dates, 3 weeks before the dinner, I said. 3 weeks before. I looked at the origination date on the first loan statement. The timeline ran together neatly, the well-dressed man, the leather portfolio, the leaning-in conversation. 3 weeks before the dinner that had ended with me in my car in the dark with a casserole dish on the passenger seat. You're not wrong to have not said anything, I told her. You had nothing to say. You still don't know who he was. No, Patricia agreed. But you could ask James. I could. I folded the bank letter and set it on top of the legal pad. Or I could wait. Patricia looked at me. Wait for what? For Daniel. I picked up my coffee cold now, but I drank it anyway. He knows about the title discrepancy. He got the refinance denial. He's going to start pulling at that thread eventually. And when he does, I want him to find it himself. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed on the street. The kitchen clock moved. You think forcing it would break something, she said. It was not a question. I think forced confessions never hold, I said. The kind that last are the ones people find on their own. She nodded slowly, the way she nods when she disagrees with nothing but wants to acknowledge that she has heard you fully. Then she reached across the table and pulled one of the blueberry scones from the paper bag and set it in front of me. Then we wait, she said. Then we wait. We decided to wait. The truth, we agreed, had to come from Daniel himself. Forced confessions never hold. The kind that last are the ones people find on their own. 7 days of silence. Then his name appeared on my phone. It was a Tuesday evening, just after 7. I was at the kitchen table with a book I had been trying to read for the better part of a week. The same paragraph, the same page, the same opening sentence I had started and abandoned more times than I could count. My mind had not been available for fiction lately. It had been occupied with facts. When the screen lit up, I set the book down without marking my place. Hey, sweetheart. Hey, Mom. A pause. Not long too, maybe 3 seconds, but enough. Do you have a few minutes? I have all the time you need. I heard him exhale. Not a sigh exactly, more like the careful release of air that people do when they are about to say something they have been rehearsing. I had heard that sound before, in 35 years of student conferences, in the pause before a parent told me something difficult about their child's situation at home. It was the sound of a person arriving at a conversation they could no longer postpone. Something came up with the house, he said. With the bank? I kept my voice even. What kind of something? We applied for a refinance 6 weeks ago. He spoke carefully, each sentence measured. Everything looked straightforward at first. Then last week, they sent a notice. They found an issue with the property title, a discrepancy in the ownership records. Another pause. The land beneath the structure. They said it's recorded separately in the county assessor's office. I see, I said. The loan officer told me they can't move forward until the ownership question is resolved. His voice was still controlled, but underneath it, the way a current runs beneath still water, there was something else. Not anger, not panic. Something quieter and more deliberate than either of those. "Mom, I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." The line was quiet for a moment. Outside my window, the evening had gone the deep blue it goes in late September in Nashville, that particular hour when the sky holds on to the last of the light before letting it go entirely. "Is the land in your name?" There it was. I had known the question was coming. I had known it since Patricia and I had sat at this same table with cold coffee and blueberry scones and decided that the truth had to travel at its own pace. I had known it since I folded that bank letter into the back of my legal pad and wrote "Call James tomorrow morning" in the margin. Knowing a thing is coming does not make it arrive gently. "Yes," I said. "It is." The silence that followed was 11 seconds. I know because I counted the same way I had counted every weighted silence in this situation, the instinct of a woman who had spent decades noting the space between what students said and what they meant. 11 seconds. "Okay," Daniel said. Just that word. Flat and careful, the way a man speaks when he is processing something too large to respond to immediately and doesn't trust himself to say more than one word at a time. "Daniel, can I ask you something else?" "Of course." Another pause, shorter this time. "Did Dad know? I mean, was this always the arrangement? That the land stayed in your name?" "Yes," I said. "It was always your father's intention. He never transferred it." He was quiet again. I let the quiet be. I had learned, in all those years of classroom silences, that the worst thing you can do when someone is thinking is fill the space before they are ready. Some thoughts need room to become themselves. When Daniel spoke again, his voice had shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, a fraction lower, a fraction more careful. The voice of a man who has just asked 2 questions and received 2 honest answers and is now somewhere behind his eyes, beginning to arrange those answers alongside other things he already knows. "Is there anything else I should know?" he asked. It was the most careful question of the conversation. Not tell me everything, not an accusation, not a demand. A door left deliberately ajar. He was giving me the option to walk through it, and at the same time, something in the phrasing told me he was not yet ready for everything that was on the other side. "There are things I've learned recently," I said, "but I think you need to do your own looking first. When you're ready to talk, I'll tell you everything I know." A beat of silence. "Okay," he said again, same word, different weight. "I love you, Daniel." "I love you too, Mom." The call ended at 7, 18 inches the evening. I set the phone down on the table and looked at it for a moment. The way you look at something after a significant thing has just passed through it and left it unchanged on the surface. I picked up my yellow legal pad and turned to a new page. I wrote the date, then I wrote 1 line. He asked. I confirmed. "He's looking now." I set the pen down. The kitchen was quiet. The persimmon tree had gone dark in the yard, just a silhouette now against the deep blue September sky. The rosemary on the windowsill held its sharp, clean scent in the still air. Everything around me was exactly as it had been before the phone rang. But something had moved. He didn't ask me anything else. But the silence after that question was different from every silence that had come before. This one was full of something. I recognized it because I had felt it myself, standing at a mailbox 3 days earlier. It was the silence of a man beginning to understand that something was very wrong. Daniel didn't come to me with the truth. He found it himself. That distinction matters more than I can explain. I have thought about this often in the months since the difference between being told something and discovering it. A person who is told can always find reasons to doubt the teller. Bias, they might think. Motive. Misunderstanding. But a person who finds something with their own hands, in their own time, sitting alone in a room with no one to question and no version of events to weigh against another, that person has no such shelter. What they find is simply what is there. That was what I had been waiting for. That was why I had told Daniel to do his own looking. I did not know when it would happen. I had no way of knowing. I went about my Thursday as I had gone about every day in the 3 weeks since the dinner, carefully, quietly, with the particular patience of someone who has put a thing in motion and must now wait for it to arrive at its own pace. I weeded the garden that morning. I called James Whitfield in the afternoon to let him know about the 10-day verification deadline and confirm that he had received my written authorization. I made soup for dinner, chicken and vegetables, nothing complicated, and ate it at the kitchen table with my book, which I had finally managed to advance by 2 full chapters. At 8:47 inches the evening, my phone rang. The call was 4 seconds long before Daniel spoke. 4 seconds of background silence, no television, no music, the kind of quiet that belongs to a room where someone has been sitting alone for a while. I noticed it the way you notice the absence of something ordinary. One word, just my name, but the way he said it reached through the phone and rearranged something in my chest. I had heard that exact quality in his voice only a handful of times in his life, the particular rawness of a person whose understanding of something has just shifted so completely that language hasn't caught up yet. "I'm here," I said. He didn't answer immediately. I heard him breathe once, slow and deliberate, the kind of breath a person takes when they are trying to hold something together while they figure out what to do next. "I was looking through her laptop," he said finally. "Kristen's. She went to her sister's for the night." A pause. "I was looking for the property insurance documents. I thought maybe there was something in there that would explain the bank situation." "Okay," I said. I found a folder. His voice was very quiet now, measured in the way that people are measured when the alternative is falling apart entirely. It had emails in it, a lot of them. From before we even met. I set my spoon down on the table. I did not reach for my legal pad. I did not reach for anything. I just sat still and let him talk. "There was a name on the emails," he continued. "Someone she had been corresponding with. About land, about property, about—" He stopped, started again. "About how to acquire assets held by elderly owners through the process of marriage." The words fell into the kitchen like stones into still water. I waited for the ripples to settle before I spoke. "How far back do the emails go?" 3 months before she and I met. His voice fractured slightly on the last word, not dramatically, not into tears, but in the precise, controlled way of a man who is allowing himself exactly one small crack and no more. 3 months before, I ran into her at that conference in Memphis. She was already. He stopped. In 35 years of teaching, I had sat with students in moments exactly like this one, the moment when a young person's understanding of a situation outpaces their ability to articulate it. The correct response was never to fill the silence. It was to stay present inside it, so the person knew they were not in it alone. "Take your time," I said. He took a breath. Outside my window, the September night was completely still, no wind, no traffic, just the dark and the distant sound of a neighbor's screen door somewhere down the street. I thought about Daniel sitting in that house on Deerwood Lane, alone with a laptop screen and the particular cold illumination of something you cannot unsee. I thought about the conference in Memphis. He had mentioned the way Daniel had described meeting Kristen that weekend as something that had felt accidental, effortless, the kind of encounter that seems to belong to luck rather than design. He had called me from the hotel that Sunday evening, the particular lightness in his voice that I hadn't heard in years. "She's different, Mom," he had said. "She actually listens." I had been happy for him, genuinely, completely happy. I sat with that memory now and felt it change shape, not disappear, not become something shameful, but shift in the way that memories do when you learn something that recontextualizes them. The happiness had been real. Daniel's had certainly been real. What had not been real was the accident of it. I thought about Robert, who had spent years making careful decisions in quiet rooms so that this moment or some version of it would have a foundation to land on. "I keep reading them," Daniel said. "I've read them probably 6 times, and every time I get to the end I think maybe I missed something. Maybe there's a different way to understand it." A pause that lasted just long enough to feel like a door closing. "There isn't." "No," I said softly. "There isn't." Silence again. Longer this time, the kind that belongs to a man who has just closed a door on one version of his life and has not yet turned around to see what room he is standing in now. When he spoke again, his voice was shaking in a way I hadn't heard since he was 10 years old and stood at his father's graveside, that particular tremor that comes not from weakness but from the effort of holding too much at once. "Mom," he said, "I need to show you something. How soon can you get here?" When I walked into Daniel's house that afternoon, it was the first time in months the door opened before I even knocked. He must have been watching from the window. He was already standing in the doorway when I came up the porch steps, no jacket, no shoes, the same gray pullover from 3 days ago. He looked like a man who had not moved much since he had hung up the phone. The oak tree in the front yard caught the last of the September light behind him, and for a moment the whole scene had the quality of something I had been moving toward for a very long time without knowing it. He stepped back. I walked in. The house was quieter than I had ever heard it. No music, no television, nothing running in the background. The overhead light in the kitchen was on, and the laptop was open on the table, the same table where Kristen had told me, 8 months earlier, that my seat was not for me. Daniel sat across from where he had placed a chair for me. Between us, the laptop screen glowed with an open email thread. "I want you to read them," he said. "All of them. Start from the bottom." I sat down and I read. The earliest email in the thread was dated 14 months before the Memphis conference. The correspondent was listed as G. Cole, Asset Consultation Services. The subject line read, East Nashville Residential Acquisition Pathway Discussion. In plain, professional language, Garrett Cole had outlined what he called a long-term asset integration strategy. The target, described without name but with specific geographic and demographic details that matched Robert's land precisely, was held by a widowed senior owner with a single adult heir. Cole described the recommended approach as establishing a relationship with the heir, building residential proximity, and initiating formal documentation only after sufficient marital and financial integration had occurred. He noted that the most reliable transfer mechanism, in cases where direct purchase was not viable, was what he termed default inheritance positioning, ensuring that by the time the senior owner passed, all relevant assets would have already shifted into the marital estate. He had written it the way a contractor writes a project plan, methodical, detailed, entirely without sentiment. I read to the end of the thread. Then I closed the laptop gently and folded my hands on top of it. "Okay," I said. Daniel was watching me. His eyes were red at the edges, not from crying, I thought, but from the particular strain of staring at a screen for hours while your understanding of your own life reorganizes itself around new information. "I need to show you something too," I said. I reached into my bag and took out the bank letter, all 3 pages, folded once along the crease I had made on that Wednesday morning at the kitchen counter. I set it in front of him and watched him read it the same way I had read it, once for comprehension, once for confirmation, a third time because the mind resists accepting what the eyes have already seen. He set the pages down. $200,000, he said. $203,000, I said. 3 separate loans. The first originated 4 months after your wedding. He pressed his palms flat on the table, a long, controlled exhale. Outside, the oak tree moved in the evening breeze barely, just a suggestion of motion, and the kitchen light held everything in its warm, steady circle. "Mom." His voice had dropped to something very quiet. "She told me over the past year, she told me that you were losing your memory, that you were getting confused, that some of the things you said weren't adding up." He paused. "She said she was worried about you, that it might be better for everyone if we gave you some space." The words arrived without shock. I had known, in the part of myself that keeps careful records, that something like this had been said. I had felt its effects in the shortening of Sunday calls, in the careful distance that had opened up between my son and me like a slow tide going out. But hearing it stated plainly, in Daniel's voice, in this kitchen that was different from knowing it. "I know, sweetheart," I said. "That's how she kept us apart." He looked at me for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not guilt exactly, because Daniel had done nothing wrong. Something more like the particular grief of a person who realizes they were used as an instrument against someone they loved. "I believed her," he said. "I know. I should have called more. I should have. Daniel." I reached across the table and put my hand over his, the way I had done at this same table in different circumstances when he was young and needed to be steadied. "You were working with the information you had. So was I. Neither of us had the full picture until now." He looked down at my hand on his. Then he turned his hand over, the way he always has, so he was holding mine instead. We sat like that for a while, not speaking, not needing to. The 3 pages of the bank letter lay between us alongside the closed laptop, and the kitchen was very quiet, and outside the oak tree held its position in the last of the September evening. Then Daniel straightened. He let go of my hand. He looked at the laptop, then at the bank letter, then at me. "What do we do?" he said. "We call James Whitfield," I said. "First thing tomorrow morning." He nodded once. We sat at that kitchen table for 2 hours. By the time headlights swept across the front window, we knew exactly what we were going to do. And we were ready. Kristen walked in expecting an empty house. She found us both sitting at the table, waiting. The front door opened at 9:43. I know the time because I had been watching the clock above the refrigerator for the last 20 minutes, not anxiously, but with the particular focused calm of someone who understands that the moment they have been moving toward for a very long time is now measurably close. Daniel sat across from me. The laptop was open between us. The bank letter lay flat beside it, all 3 pages unfolded. We had not spoken much in the last half hour. There was nothing left to plan. Everything that needed to be said had already been said, and what remained now was simply the act of saying it to the right person. She came in the way she always did, keys in one hand, bag on her shoulder, the practiced ease of a woman who had spent the better part of a year moving through this house as though it had always been hers. Her heels were quiet on the hardwood. She was halfway through the entry before she registered what she was seeing. 2 people at the kitchen table, laptop open, papers spread flat. No music, no television, just light and silence and 2 pairs of eyes turning toward her at the same moment. She stopped. "Ellie." She said my name first, not Daniel's. Mine. And in a tone I had not heard from her before, something between recognition and rapid recalculation, the sound of a person whose internal compass has just detected something it was not prepared for. Her eyes moved from me to Daniel, then to the table, then to the laptop screen. I watched her read the subject line from across the room. I watched the small, almost imperceptible shift in her expression, the tightening at the corners, the fractional stillness. "Sit down, Kristen," Daniel said. His voice was quiet. Not cold, something more precise than cold. The voice of a man who has spent 3 days in a room with an unbearable truth and has come out the other side of it into something that feels, if not like peace, then like clarity. She set her bag down on the counter. She pulled out the chair at the end of the table, the chair she had always claimed as her own, and sat. For a moment, nobody spoke. The kitchen held the particular silence of a room where something has already been decided, and the only remaining question is the shape of the saying. Daniel reached over and turned the laptop to face her. "I want to read something to you," he said. "Daniel, whatever you think I'm going to read it out loud, not a request. A statement of what was going to happen, delivered without heat and without apology." He read. He started with the first email from Garrett Cole, the one dated 14 months before the Memphis conference. Subject line, East Nashville Residential Acquisition Pathway Discussion. He read the demographic profile of the target property. He read the phrase widowed senior owner with a single adult heir. He read the recommended approach of establishing residential proximity and marital integration. He read the term default inheritance positioning slowly and without inflection, because some phrases do not require editorial emphasis. They carry their own weight. His voice stayed level through all of it. He did not look at Kristen while he read. He looked at the screen, and his voice was steady, and the kitchen was absolutely quiet. When he finished, he set the laptop down and looked at her. Kristen's hands were on the table. She had not moved them. Her face, the face I had studied across 8 months of dinners and Sunday calls, and one catastrophic September evening, was doing something I had never seen it do before. The careful composure that had always been her most reliable instrument was failing, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way a well-maintained surface fails when the structure beneath it has given way one fine line, then another, then the whole thing becoming visible for what it actually was. "That's not. There are 11 emails," Daniel said. "I've read every one. I'd like to hear you explain what it is, if it isn't what it looks like." She opened her mouth, then she closed it. I had seen that moment before, in students who had run out of story. Some cried, some got angry, some simply went quiet in the way that signals not defeat but the exhaustion of pretending. Kristen went quiet. Daniel picked up his phone and placed it in the center of the table, screen facing up. James Whitfield's face filled the frame he had been on the call for the past 6 minutes, listening from his Church Street office. the oak desk visible behind him, and the framed Tennessee bar certificate on the wall catching the lamplight. "Mrs. Harmon," James said, in the careful, unhurried voice I had come to trust completely, "I want to ensure you understand the legal position before this conversation goes further. The land underlying the Deerwood Lane property remains titled solely to Eleanor Grace Harmon. The 3 mortgage instruments issued by Consolidated Lending Solutions, totaling $203,000, were secured against a property whose underlying land title was not held by the borrower at the time of company. Application. Under Tennessee statute, that constitutes a material misrepresentation in each loan instrument. The lending institution has been formally notified. Their verification window closes in 72 hours. He paused, and his voice did not change when he added, "I would strongly advise you to retain your own counsel before that deadline." The room was completely still. Kristen looked at the phone. She looked at the bank letter. She looked at the laptop screen with the email thread still visible. And for the first time since I had known her, there was nowhere in the room for her eyes to land that did not show her something she could not explain away. She had run out of angles. Daniel stood. He was not a large man, but in that moment he filled the kitchen with something that had nothing to do with size, the particular weight of a person who has grieved something fully and arrived at the quiet, solid ground on the other side of it. He looked at Kristen for a long moment, not with rage, not with contempt, with the steady, clear-eyed look of a man who has finished being deceived and is now simply done. Then he turned to me. "This is my mother," he said. "She will always have a seat at this table." I did not cry. I had done my crying weeks before, alone in a car in the dark, with a casserole dish on the passenger seat and the windows fogged from the cold. What I felt in that moment was something quieter and far more permanent than tears, the specific, grounded feeling of a thing being returned to what it had always been, not restored, returned, as though it had never truly left. I looked at my son. I nodded once. For the first time since I had known her, Kristen had nothing to say, no carefully chosen words, no controlled expression, just the truth, sitting in the room with all of us, exactly where it had always belonged. 6 months later, the legal process had run its course, and the Nashville morning light came through my kitchen window the way it always had, warm, unhurried, like it had nowhere else to be. I was at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee when Daniel came in from the back porch. He had been out there for 20 minutes with his own cup, the way Robert used to be on weekend mornings, not restless, not scrolling through anything, just standing in the yard looking at the persimmon tree like it had something worth considering. I had watched him through the window and not said a word. Some things deserve the space to be what they are. He came inside and set his cup on the counter and reached for the coffee pot. And for a moment, in the particular angle of the morning light and the particular way he held his arm out toward the counter, he looked so much like his father that I had to look down at my hands for a second before I could continue what I was thinking. "You want a warm-up?" he asked. "Please," I said. He poured. He sat down across from me. Between us on the table, the blue and white striped dish towel from the Franklin Market was folded neatly beside the casserole dish, the same one I had carried up the porch steps 8 months ago. Still warm, wrapped in that same towel, full of something I had made for people who were not ready to receive it. It sat there now, not as a symbol of anything, but simply as what it was, a dish that belonged in this kitchen, on this table, between these two people. I thought about what the past 6 months had looked like, measured in practical terms. Consolidated Lending Solutions had completed their title audit within the original 10-day window. James Whitfield had filed the necessary documentation with the county assessor's office, confirming Eleanor Grace Harmon as sole title holder of the Deerwood Lane land. The 3 mortgage instruments were formally invalidated as fraudulent. The lending institution had referred the matter to the district attorney's office, and by January, Kristen was facing 3 counts of financial fraud under Tennessee statute, each tied to a loan application in which she had materially misrepresented the ownership of collateral she did not control. The divorce proceedings had been Daniel's decision, made quietly and without drama in the week following that Friday evening. He had retained his own attorney. The process had taken 4 months. By March, it was final. He had moved into a rental house 12 minutes from mine in February, while the paperwork was still working its way through the courts. He had arrived with his truck, a set of tools, and a framed photograph of Robert in a hard hat that he set on the mantel the day he moved in. The first weekend, he had come to my house for breakfast. He had been coming most weekends since. None of this happened loudly. There were no declarations, no dramatic turning points beyond the one that had already occurred. The healing, if that is the right word for it, proceeded the way most real healing does, in small, unremarkable increments, each one easy to overlook and meaningful only in accumulation. The persimmon tree bloomed in April, right on schedule. I thought about Robert often during those months, not with grief exactly, though grief was part of it, but with the particular gratitude you feel for a person who understood something important long before you needed to know it. He had kept that land in my name not out of suspicion or strategic foresight. He had done it out of love, the practical, unglamorous, long-range kind of love that does not announce itself but simply builds things that last. He had been gone for 4 years. In those 4 years, without knowing it, without any fanfare at all, his quiet decision had protected everything he cared about. I had walked past the safe in my bedroom closet 1,000 times without opening it, and when I finally did, on a night when I needed it most, everything he had prepared was exactly where he had left it. I had thought, on many of those in-between mornings, about patience, about what it actually costs and what it actually produces. I had spent 35 years telling students that the most important work was often the work nobody saw, the preparation, the attention, the willingness to stay present without immediate reward. I had believed it as a professional principle. It had taken this year to understand it as something personal. There is a kind of strength that does not look like strength from the outside. It is not loud. It does not require an audience. It keeps records and stays clear-eyed and trusts, without certainty, that the truth has a direction and will eventually travel in it. I had always admired that quality in others. I was still learning how to claim it in myself. Daniel looked up from his coffee. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm thinking," I said. "About what?" I looked at the persimmon tree through the kitchen window, the same view I had looked at through every season of the last 4 years. It was late March now, the first suggestions of green coming back to the branches, the yard beginning to shake off winter the way it always did slowly, then all at once. "About your father," I said, about how far ahead he was thinking. Daniel was quiet for a moment. He wrapped both hands around his mug the way he does when he is not in a hurry to speak, and he looked at the tree, too. "Yeah," he said finally, "me too." We sat together in the morning light, not filling the silence, not rushing past it, just 2 people sharing a kitchen and a history and a table that had always had room for both of us. If you have stayed with me through all of it, the casserole dish, the sealed envelope, the 11 emails, that Friday evening in the kitchen on Deerwood Lane, then I want to say one thing directly before we close. I did not tell this story because it ended well. Plenty of things don't. I told it because of what it required along the way. Patience that had no guarantee attached to it, dignity maintained in moments when no one would have blamed me for losing it, a son who chose, when it mattered, to look for the truth rather than away from it, and a man who had been gone for 4 years, who had loved his family carefully enough that his love was still working in the world, still protecting the people he cared about, long after he was no longer here to do it himself. That is the part I keep coming back to. Robert used to say that land is the only thing that lasts. He was right. But sitting here now, watching my son pour coffee the way his father used to, I think what lasts even longer is the truth about who people really are and the love strong enough to survive finding it out.